Hey friends, you know how I love great podcasts, and I want you to check out the Code Newbie podcast. It's all about stories from folks on their coding journey. They talk to new developers, experienced developers, and everyone in between about how they got started learning to code, how they navigate their technical careers, and they also do deep dives into technical topics in a newbie-friendly way. Check out their podcast at www.codenewbie, that's NEWBIE.org/podcast. That's codenewbie.org/podcast. Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Daniel José Older. He's an American fantasy writer, a young adult fiction writer, person on the internet, and the most recent book that he's put out is called Ballad and Dagger. It's the first of the Outlaw Saints novels. How are you, sir?
I'm very happy to be here. How are you doing?
I'm pretty excited, and the reason I'm excited is that I've followed you on Twitter, I think before you were famous. I don't know if it's okay to say famous.
I'll take it. Sure.
I mean, I could be remembering this wrong, but I seem to remember you've been on Twitter for probably since 2009 or 10.
Yep.
And I thought you were working in New York as an EMT.
Correct.
And just talking smack on the internet with the rest
Correct.
of us.
Yes, that's true. That is absolutely correct.
Okay. So I've been following you since Jump, and now you have written 18 books. How did that happen?
How did that happen? That's a fantastic question. I ask myself all the time. This is not my beautiful house, but it is.
Exactly.
I really love writing. I never set out to be a prolific writer. I wasn't like, I'm going to be the guy that writes 18 books or puts out 2 books a year or whatever. It's sheer love of writing and joy in the process. And selling books in series also means you have to put out more books. And so that was a great thing and something I worked really hard at. And here we are.
So when you're working as an EMT and you're doing a regular job like the rest of us, are you slapping the keyboard? Are you writing quietly? I've heard that people who put out a lot of books have books that they wrote before they were a public writer.
Let's see. The only one that I haven't put out, which I hope is far in a drawer far away from anyone, I wrote when I was when I just left high school. I drove across country and lived in San Francisco, and I was a bike messenger and a waiter. And I wrote a book back then, like a very romantic idea of what it meant to be a writer, and it was a mess. I think that's my only unpublished book. But once I kind of sat down, now mind you, my first book, Shadow Shaper, was rejected 40 times. It changed gigantically in the process of being published and everything else. So it's definitely been a windy road. It wasn't just like, all right, I'm gonna be a writer, and then I just put out 18 books. Right? It took a couple of years to get traction.
Yeah, but Shadow Shaper, you say you shopped it around and people rejected it, but then the next thing you know, it was published by Scholastic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly, and that's publishing. Is like the highs and the lows, like they happen simultaneously, and you're always trying to kind of like maneuver through that, and they still happen. Even when you have an established career. There's one of my books. It took about 5 years to get published, even though I was already a published writer, and that's just them's the breaks, right?
One of the things that I've noticed as being a consumer and a reader of a ton of media, I go through probably a book a week, is the way that I interact with authors and have a relationship with authors has changed since Twitter and Facebook and social media in general. Before, I just assumed that they were like, I don't know, Stephen King's, James Patterson's types. Right. They were just in a ivory tower somewhere.
Right.
Thinking big thoughts, and then twice a year a book would pop out of Walden Pond. but you're on Twitter, living your life,
yes,
taking pictures of your food. When you're upset about something, you talk about it. Mm-hmm. How has being a creative in public changed, like for you, in the sense of though you were this was always the way for you though, but you must have been interacting with writers and social media before you were a writer.
Almost simultaneously though. And that blew my mind too, that like writers are people, and I do think that one of the great things about that is that it's changed our understanding of what it means to be a writer. And like, it's made it so much more real I know for me, like I had the same thing with you. I was like, there's no way I could be a writer. I'm not that guy who's a writer. Like, it doesn't make sense. Even though I love writing and it's like my first language. But I just not knowing writers, it just seemed like that was an impossibility. And it was a combination of realizing that writers are people too, and interacting with some on Twitter and being like, oh, wow, this is wild. I read this person's book and now they're talking to me. But also for me, it was in a similar way, it was blogging that really broke that down because as when I was a medic, I would come home from a graveyard shift and I would just write about whatever happened and I would keep a blog and whatever nonsense it was. I would do it on Twitter too, but I would also do like a short narrative like, oh, this dude was having a heart attack and here's what we did. And we gave him this and that and the other. Then we got in a fight with his family and right? And there were these little vignettes, but they were easy for me to write and they were cool stories just as like little moments and people were into them. And I was like, if I just make some shit up, this would be fiction. Like literally, like, and it just broke something down in me that I had held up. I did want to write a book, but I thought I had to be like a monk to write a book or like some kind of god, like it just didn't seem, or if I was going to do it, it would have to be this incredible, like great American novel and all that, just like chill. Like really, it just comes down to telling the story. What happened? Tell the story. That's it. And then, you bring in layers of meaning or they naturally happen throughout the course of the story. But I just think we put writers and books on this pedestal that like can be very dangerous to the craft itself sometimes.
Interesting. I have a good friend, Lauren Bucas, who wrote The Shining Girls, and there's a show
I love
on
Laura Bucas. She's so
Lauren's
amazing.
great, isn't she
Yeah,
cool?
she's so cool.
And in this is a kind of a deep cut, but in always, I think it's Always Sunny in Philadelphia when the conspiracy theory guy has got like all there's a GIF of it of all the Post-it notes all over the
Yeah,
wall of all this
yeah,
stuff. That's Lauren's process for a book, right? She knows whatever it's multi-layered. There's time travel.
yes,
It's all over the place.
yes,
I write technical works. I've written a half dozen technical books, but it's easy to make them linear because it's like, here's how to
right.
think about the thing.
The process.
Do you have a crazed wall of Post-it notes? How do you keep track of all the layers? Because your wall's so clean.
Yes, because everything on there was a spoiler for Star Wars. Literally, I almost got in trouble having stuff behind me once doing a podcast, and the PR person had to be like, "Wait, let me look at that wall with a magnifying glass and make sure that there's nothing on there." I was very
so there is a non-linear like wall in your mind.
Yes, yes. Literally, this wall it had the entire Phase 1 of the High Republic on this wall for a period of time with book covers and scratches and notes and everything else. What I've found is that every book really does demand a very different process for itself. And for the first chunk of years of my career, up until very recently, actually, I did not outline much at all. I really didn't. I would just jump into a book. And the joy of writing the book was the chaos of it and finding out what happens as I go. And that was also my way of tracking how a reader might feel their emotional journey through the book because I didn't know what was going to happen. So if I was excited and dying to find out, I knew a reader would be too. And at a certain point, I had to leave that behind, in part because writing for franchises like Star Wars, you have to have some sense of things going through because you're working on a team, but also just processes change. And so Ballad and Dagger, I outlined extremely meticulously. I mean, I did literally outlines of outlines and then more in-depth outlines, and every chapter had it. It was like, it turns out there's a lot of chaos to be had in that process too. And so I figured out ways to enjoy it, and now that's my process.
So Ballad and Dagger is an Outlaw Saints novel. Is it the first of two or the first of N?
It is the first of two.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in order to do that, in order to write two books, you've got to have a plan for the end of the second book. So you must have outlaw, I would be.
I didn't.
You did not.
No.
As a reader, I don't know if we're giving spoilers, but it's like, how do I feel about the fact that you put a book out without knowing how you're going to end it?
Well, that's a good question. I will say that having now finished it, it worked.
Okay, it worked. I'm glad.
It's a process. Like writing is always a process of faith and trust, and you're also balancing that with if you're working on a team, with all these different things. And with this, it was like these two books are a perfect example. Book one, Outlaw Saints book 1, Ballad and Dagger, was the most meticulous I've ever gone with outlines, and I was plotting it, and I was still surprised by stuff. Outlaw Saints book 2 was the opposite. I had to jump into it. I had a brief synopsis, but I truly didn't know what it was going to be until I wrote it. And again, like you're the other, George R. R. Martin famously said, there's architects and there's gardeners, right? And having been a gardener for most of my career, I still always plant seeds, even now that I'm more of an architect. And those do grow in very surprising and beautiful ways.
Yeah, I love that. That's see, the musicality and the way that you choose your words and describe. People must have known you were a writer, even when you were driving the bus there, and as an EMT.
Yeah, I think that was there. I think the vibe was there. For me, it was always like, what's the medium going to be? I knew I was a storyteller, but when I was a kid,
Mm.
it was drawing monsters. When I was in my 20s, it was music. And so most of the time I was a medic, I was actually like moonlighting as a musician or vice versa, depending on the day. And
I,
yeah,
I love that you brought up music though, because you spend pages and pages and pages in text, black
yeah.
text on a white page, explaining music. And I'm like, man, he's on page 3 and we're still vibing with this young piano player. And I have to say, the first time I was like, well, what do I feel about this?
Right.
And then I wanted more and I wanted more. Was that a challenge to try to express in Ballad and Dagger? Because music, like Ballad, it's like fundamental to
It's
this
fundamental.
young protagonist's life. How did you explain music for pages and pages?
The challenge was to make it work with the story, right? Because it's not a music book, it's not a textbook,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
and so it has to be fundamentally, woven into the fabric of the plot, and it already was for the world building and for the character, but it has to move the story forward, and that's where we get those sort of set pieces later in, where it really does come to play a role. Mateo's love of music is actually crucial to his ability to figure out the problems he's in and figure out the world, whether it's in a mystical way or in like a very concrete code breaking kind of way. Those pieces all come into play.
Yeah. One of the things that I appreciated about it, and I don't know if this is your impression, but I felt like it took its time to build the world. It was respecting the fact that this is a world you haven't seen before.
Hmm.
Hang in there. I've got some stuff to say. And you didn't introduce the big bad
Hmm.
like in a prologue. You know how books are like welcome. Let's we open scene 1 and the big bad's a tower, and
Right.
then we meet our young protagonist. You know what I mean? You spent a lot of time
Yeah.
just talking about where these folks are from.
Yeah. The world matters so much in this story, and it's such a particular and strange world that they're from, even though it's this world that they live in. And so balancing all those pieces, they really did have to like settle in and be part of the fabric of the entire story from the beginning. And it is challenging. It was a challenge to get all that in there and make it make sense. But I knew it was a worthwhile one, because once we are sort of fully settled in that world and everything starts to pop off. I mean, it pops off in the right, we do begin with a murder, right? There's a
Oh
murder in
yeah,
chapter
yeah,
one,
very
but
true.
then it's like untangling, like how does that fit into everything else, and how does it fit into this world? And most of all, so much of this book is about history catching up with us and walking with us. And
Hmm.
for that to really hit, the history has to feel real and it has to matter.
Yeah, this very much felt like I have to admit I went to Wikipedia a couple of times looking for words and stuff, and I was like, oh, okay, that's real. Oh, well, that's not a thing. And
That's my sweet spot. I love that. I don't know why. I love that. People are like, it's that mix. This is fantasy, and it should feel really real, lived in, and at the same time, it should feel exciting and imaginary. All those things are kind of in the balance,
yeah.
and I love doing that. So success.
Hey, friends, I hope you're enjoying this episode as much as I am. We're going to take a brief break and we're going to pay the bills and have a chat with our sponsor, Raygun. Sponsors like Raygun make shows like this possible. JD from Raygun, I am realizing that I am afraid of my website. I am afraid of it at runtime because I just don't know what it's doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to like our own health, right? Do I go to the doctor and find out something's wrong, or do I just kind of pretend that maybe I'm okay? And, frankly, the healthiest people, they're getting checked up.
That's exactly right. And when I plugged in Raygun error, crash, and performance monitoring, what I'm seeing immediately are bugs. I was flooded with them, and I was like, oh no, this is horrible. But then I started realizing as Raygun starts to categorize them and bucket them, and realize that, well, these are normal runtime bugs. These are script kiddies. These are people poking around asking for files that don't exist. But then I could start to see where, how, and why the users that I care about are getting errors. And I went from being afraid to go to the doctor to wanting to turn Raygun on all of my projects, like by default.
Absolutely. One thing with Raygun is it's about connecting the code. We say code to customer, but really it's about the user. It is always about the user. It's not really about the software at all. And so how do we make sure we're understanding which of our users are having a great time and which ones could we improve it for?
That is a great point, because those users, they don't want to send me log files. They don't want to go and collect the bugs and the repros and stuff like that. So Raygun gives me the line of code and information about the user that's private, that says this user in this country is having a problem, or this user at this time on this platform is having an issue, and I can go straight to the solution. And it's like a support assistant and a dedicated reliability engineer that presents me a clear bug report. And it's fantastic. So folks can go to raygun.com. They can sign up for a trial, and you can have this same experience that I'm having, this epiphany of Schrodinger's bug. You can go and find out the bugs at runtime that you're missing, and you can take control of your experience and your user's experience. Check it out at raygun.com. When did you get the idea to not just make up a bunch of words? There's some memes on TikTok about fantasy writers, and it's like, in the age of word you've never heard of, the young word you've never heard of did word you've never heard of. And it's just like, you got to just pound through a bunch of nonsense in a completely made up world where just nouns don't have any meaning. You grounded this in both today and colonialism and multiracialism, but also made a Caribbean island that didn't exist.
Right. Yeah. I always think about, there's this moment that people talk a lot about in Spirited Away, the Miyazaki movie, where the main character taps her little shoe when she's putting it on. And it's like that little moment where it's so like, that's such an 11-year-old girl moment that she does that. And it's so real and human and grounded. And around her, there's monsters and dragons. And like those two things, that's the balance right there. And not only each creator, but certainly each project needs its own balance. And that's almost the fundamental question, I would say, of each project is like, what is that balance going to be? And how are we going to ground it enough so that when we go off into these other adventures, it still feels real? With Ballad of Dagger, it started actually as a story for younger readers about this kid, Mateo Matisse. It was called Mateo Matisse Monster Murker. And it's going to be this kid who goes around murking monsters. And it was going to be a much more direct connect to Santeria, and only Santeria. And I'm a priest in that tradition. I'm initiated, and it's a tradition I carry in the blood through my family in different ways. And it's one I feel very close to, and still I didn't know how to get the spirits from that tradition onto the page in a way that felt right. And especially as I moved into it being a young adult novel and thus becoming bigger and more complex, I knew I had to be able to have free reign with the spirits in this story, the demons in the story, the different spiritual traditions in the story. So I wanted it to be grounded spiritually in different faiths that really exist, but I also needed to have the freedom to move around, create new creatures, create new gods and saints, and have them be fallible in different ways and very human. And that's really where San Madrigal came from. It came from that need to be able to be playful, but also still ground things. And, every tradition is a hodgepodge mishmash of everything else in so many ways. But we have these ideas of purity that I think get us really tripped up. So creating a new one was just a matter of like, well, what different traditions can we throw into the pot to see what would come out?
In doing that, though, I feel like sometimes fantasy writers who make stuff up completely are being safe, because it's like, if I just make stuff up, then I'm not going to offend anybody. But right, Santeria is a synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
I think they call it a syncretism between Yoruba and Christianity, and it's all these things. It's a mashup of the best of multiple things. For you, as someone who is steeped in this practice, but then to also change it, how are you being careful that someone's not going to get to like at page 42 and go, what? That you just took my thing I care deeply about, and then you changed it. You probably should have just made something up.
That's a great question. I think the thing is like, who are you going to offend? Like you are always going to step on somebody's toes, right?
Mm.
And I think that's okay. I think you have to be very intentional about whose toes you're going to step on, so that you don't punch down and you don't step on the same people whose toes have always been stepped on throughout literary history. That's a reality. So in that thought process, going into an equation where there are these real traditions that we're dealing with, I don't think it's automatically a problem to put real traditions on the page. There's a, that's what we do. We have to do it respectfully, and we have to do it with honesty. And I think that's
Mm.
where we often get into trouble, is that when people start to get into real stuff, they also want to dip and dodge around the ugly histories that those include. And that's, I think, where we have to look directly in the face and say, whether it's colorism in Latino culture, or just anti-Blackness and the globalness of it all, gender issues that come up within a lot of different cultures. Like, those are always the things that we have to be aware of. And the added challenge, I think, especially for writers of color and communities of color, is that a lot of those like negative sides of stuff, white supremacy has used against us to say how terrible we are, right? So we have to be mindful of like the stereotypes, like machismo, right, is a stereotype. But patriarchy is still a real thing in the Latino community that we have to deal with and think about as writers and as readers. And so it's like, managing those two things, you can get lost. But what you can't do is pretend that they don't exist just because, they're uncomfortable. That's the whole point.
Hmm. So you mashed up not only the Santeria, but also pirates and Judaism. And I have to admit, as I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, I can see pirates. That's cool. Caribbean, like Pirates of the Caribbean. Like, and then when the Judaism showed up, I was like, okay, like, is that? I mean, I am not I'm not Jewish, and I don't know a lot about it. But I was like, kind of along for the ride. I'm like, okay, is there Judaism running through the Caribbean that I don't know about,
There
or
is.
is this
That's
okay? That's amazing.
yeah, and in fact, even in some pirate culture, but a lot of, essentially, the Inquisition pushed Jews out into the world from Spain, and a lot of them ended up in the Caribbean. And there are different histories of Sephardic Jews running around the Caribbean, participating in various intense historical moments throughout colonial history, which I also didn't know about, and I was totally blown away by. And growing up, my side of Judaism is Ashkenazi. I grew up Catholic and Jewish,
Hmm.
but it was so fascinating to find this kind of little sliver of part of my culture, even if it's a related one, a sort of a sister, but my culture, and then connected to the other side of my family, which is Cuban. And, they kind of all meet in the Caribbean. And I thought that was like too much to pass up. And then obviously just pirates are pirates. I love pirates.
I mean, pirates are awesome. Everything is better if you just sprinkle some pirates
Everything
on
is better with pirates.
it. And then, like, throughout the book, I keep thinking, what was it? Like, you said a pirate, a rabbi, and a Santero walk into a bar.
It's like the founding of our entire island feels like a bad joke. It's true.
So, and now you're in New Orleans. Did you grow up in New Orleans?
No, I grew up in Boston randomly.
So when I see Outlaw Saints, I'm
Yeah.
thinking Saints. I'm thinking New Orleans. Like, is this the most personal book you've written of 18? Because it feels like it's just all about you.
It is. It totally is. It totally feels that way because it is. I'm sprinkled throughout all my books, of course, and we give
Of course.
our best and worst parts to all of our characters in different ways. But Mateo is more like me. He's just taller, but he's more like me than any other character I've written, and also just the struggles he goes through. His whole journey. So much of it is definitely just parts of myself that I was like, all right, it's time to put this in a book. If you read all my other books, you can find little parts of those, echoes of it throughout. But this was where I was really like, okay, it's time to lean into me and see what comes out.
So here I am, not a young adult, and here you are, not a young adult,
True.
and I'm reading young adult books, and we've got Rick Riordan writing writing a forward for you, who's like Mr. Young Adult. What does that mean? What is a young adult novel? How do you? I mean, are you picking vocab words? Because it didn't
Great
seem
question.
like it pulled any punches.
Yeah, well, that's actually, I think that's a key piece. I do have a definition I'm going to tell you, but I also think not pulling punches is so important when you're writing for young adults, because young adults know bullshit and they'll say it better than anybody else. And that's that's what's so awesome about them. But I do think that because publishing has its own definitions and understandings, and where to put things on the shelves and marketing and
Mm.
everything else. At the end of the day, for me, every book has a secret heart, and the secret heart is a crisis. A crisis being a turning point. And a young adult book has to have a protagonist who's a young adult, so a teenager, and the crisis has to revolve around them stepping forward into adulthood on some level. Obviously, we call that a coming of age, but I think when we go deeper, we understand like stepping forward into adulthood also means shedding some of the mythology of childhood. It also means becoming an active protagonist in your own life on some level. That might mean fighting demons. It might mean falling in love. It might mean understanding death. Hopefully it's all three, at once, I think. And that's like what great books do, is multitask on that level where you're struggling, that you give us a character who's struggling with things internally and externally and has to really physically step forward into the world to deal with them. And that's a young adult book. That's what we need from young adult literature. And I think young adults need to see stories where they're the heroes and they're active protagonists because of exactly that truth.
My kids are 14 and 16, so now that I've read Ballad and Dagger, they're going to read it next. But they're right at the age where apparently about last week, I want to say last Tuesday, I became no longer cool.
Oh, no. My condolences.
It's a huge problem because I'm cool as hell.
I know.
And exactly. And you are too. So we follow each other on Twitter. So how did you have to run it by a young person to make sure that you were still cool?
No, I know I'm cool, so I don't have to do that.
Okay, so there was no research needed.
I do run my books across by young people. Not every single one, but I usually do have some young reader who I'm like, who's someone's kid or whatever, a niece or a nephew. It depends on the project. But this one, I don't think I actually did, for whatever reason. But someone the other day was like, I had no idea how. Oh, I know. It's Tiffy Starchild. I was doing an event for Ballad and Dagger, and she is cool. She's an influencer for real. Not that you're not, but a different kind of influencer for the young people. And she was like, I thought like a 20 or a 19-year-old wrote this book. And I was like, I did it. I'm 42. So, mission accomplished.
That's fantastic. This one's a little bit of a weird question. I wrote this down first and I was like, I don't know if I want to ask this or not, but I was like, all right, I'll just go for it. Okay. Yeah. So suddenly in the year 2022, we've heard the word madrigal multiple times.
Wow.
And for a lot of us who, I'm a Chipotle Spanish speaker. Madrigal was not a word that I had, back in my head all the time. But then I start going, this is a perfect word.
Yes.
It's a poem. It's a kind of music. It's a kind of song. And then just to yourself and then another big organization decided that was the word of the year. That just happened. How did you feel about that?
I felt great about it because I was like, people will be able to pronounce it without stumbling too much. Perfect. First of all, that movie is so great. Like, I can't have any negative feelings about that movie because it's so enjoyable. So and fortunately, I was happy that it was the family name and not the place name. I think that's where it would have felt.
That would have been awkward.
Oh no! But look, actually, this book is put out by Disney, so we are all connected. So maybe the family founded the place. Who knows? But yeah, no, I did. I remember I really struggled finding that name for the island. For a while, I just really, there's a word madrugada that in Spanish that just means that it's that period of night right before dawn. And it's so beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like I just love that there's a word. I had to describe it with like 5 English words, right? But it's this beautiful.
Yeah,
Spanish
pre-dawn
word.
doesn't quite work, does it?
Doesn't work, right? And so I love that, and especially the sense of transition and transformation that entails. And that was almost the name of the island, but something about it didn't hit, and I kept looking and looking. Madrigal is also it's a kind of music, right? But it also has another deeper meaning when you get into the roots of it that describes a cove where outlaws hang out and hide out. And I was like, oh, once I saw that, it was over. I was like, that's literally like perfect. Like that's exactly. And it just sounds like a saint's name, like, right? San Madrigal, it sounds real. And so it passed all the tests of like deeper meaning sounds cool. all right, we're going with this. And and then Encanto came out, and I was like, I guess we all agree.
Oh man. Yeah, to find a word that just is the perfect thing. It's like that's the core. I hope that your giant wall of notes that we can't see just had that word right in the center and everything came off of it, you
Basically.
know? Yeah, because it's a chorus and the pirates are there and everybody's there,
Perfect.
the music and the trio,
It
the
all
idea of
fit.
of a trinity
Yep.
is important to the book as well.
Extremely. Yeah. And that
Yeah.
was fun. And so much of the book is also about new mythologies and breaking down old ones, right? To the point about what makes a young adult novel a young adult novel. That's true, I think, of an individual growing up, is that we shatter mythologies of our childhood as we grow and shed them. But it's also true of society in ways, and I think when you're really like cooking with fire or whatever that term is, it's like there's a conversation happening between the character and the world that they live in. And so watching the community of Little Madrigal go through the shedding of their own mythologies, as Mateo himself is shedding his own mythologies, and how they deal with it differently, and how is he a part of that and outside it at the same time. That's really so much of the heart of the book.
Definitely. I very much got a feeling as I was reading it of like, okay, I understand what's going on. Mateo understands what's going on. He knows who he is, where he is. And then another chapter happens and it's like, okay, I know nothing. He knows nothing. Everything has changed. And then that would happen multiple times.
I mean, that's life, right? Isn't that life? Like, I feel like that's
That is
exactly.
life.
That's also like parenthood. Like, right, I have a 7-month-old, and I'm like, every day, it's like one day, it's like, okay, I got this, and then it'll be like, nope, 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 no. Who was that person that thought he had this? What was wrong with that clown?
Exactly. So I've got both the physical book and I've also got an electronic copy of the book. And because I'm a programmer, I
Mhm.
got to do my analysis.
Please.
And you use the word intentional or intentionality
Huh.
6 times, and increasingly so as you got towards the end of the book. And
Interesting.
that intentionality and being deliberate and thoughtful seems to be a theme with the elders in this. And I'm
Yeah.
curious what intentionality means to you in this book and why that was so important.
It's so funny when you started that question. I was like, oh God, is it like 20 times? Because that I would have been like,
No, you
'cause
didn't. It wasn't on the nose. It wasn't on the nose. Like, to your point, it wasn't
right.
unnecessary.
Right. Because I have a book where the copy editor caught me using squinting 65 times. And I was like, oh God.
No, no, no. I
What
wouldn't
am
do
I
that to
doing?
you.
Yeah, no, thank God. But no, well, intentionality is it's a spiritual question. Coming to this from a spiritual perspective, so much is about your intentionality. And yes, there are rituals and there is prayer and language and understanding it. But at the end of the day, it still comes back to what you're bringing to the table in terms of what you want to happen and your precision around that and trusting that. And I think that was that's so much just something that Mateo has to get to kind of trust himself and trust his vision and what he's moving towards. And a lot of his elders are doing the best they can to push him in that direction, even though it doesn't always work. And, it goes awry. They don't always have the language to it that'll reach him. But it's kind of what Tia Lucia is trying to say the whole time. It's like, listen, right? Listen to yourself, listen to the world, and then turn that into the intentionality that you bring to whatever it is you're doing. In this case, fighting demons, but also playing the piano or praying for health or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And now you're applying that intentionality to hopefully your 19th book.
Mm.
When do I get to read part 2 of the Outlaw Saints duology?
Part 2 comes out next year, in the spring. So it is on the way. It is done. Like I said, I will tell you this, Scott, it was the hardest book I've ever written.
Why? What was
I
hard about
think
it?
it just took me in places I wasn't prepared to go. I prepared myself, but it just went. It went. I don't want to say it went off the rails because that sounds like it wasn't doing what it was
Mm.
supposed to do. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, but what it was supposed to do was hard. It was like, when you face history, it's like all well and good to be like, hey, look at your history, people of Madrigal. But this book really gets into it layer after layer, kind of unpeeling it like an onion. And also just on a physical level, the characters really go through it in a really intense way. We get another point of view in this book, which was really fun to write and exciting to have on the page. But everybody's just going through hell. So I had to accordingly go through a certain amount of hell to get the book out.
Now that that's out of you, sometimes you have a book in you, you have a tweet in you, you have a
Yes.
thing that's got to be said, it's in you, and now
Totally.
you have to get it out.
Yes.
Now that it's out, what is your dream for something like this? What does a writer think? Do you think like, I want to be a Hulu miniseries? I want to be like a movie. I want to have 20 movies. Like, what's the dream when you have this out of you now?
There's multiple dreams, of course, and of course, like I would definitely want to see this on the big screen. I can see it in my head on the big screen. More than that, though, like I almost put those in a separate category. Not that they're less, or they're just it's a different kind of dream. But most important to
Mm.
me is like I just really want to I really want readers to just get deep in this world and love it deeply as deeply as I do, and like, create work based on it. Like fan art is so incredible to me. And my last book, Midnight Horizon, because it was part of the Star Wars world, especially, it really generated this incredible kind of like, it's almost, I don't know, response is like too simple a word, but it just feels like you're in such direct conversation with an audience, with the
Mm.
readership. Kind of to your earlier point about social media, like this all takes place in that sphere, but in a different way when there's a book involved and people are responding to the book with art, with memes, like all of that. It's just such a profound way to experience being a writer and being a reader and being in community with writers and readers. So I'm really excited about even the response I've already gotten from readers and just how moved people have been by the book and different facets of the storytelling that they haven't experienced in books before. All those things. That's really my dream for the book.
Yeah, I feel bad for authors who aren't in direct connection with the fandom. The
Totally.
feeling, the direct feeling of like serotonin squirted directly in your brain when you just open your phone and there's fan art, and you
It's
were sleeping and you woke up and there was fan art.
unparalleled. Unparalleled. There's literally nothing like it in the world. And I understand like it's not always that happy, right? So I get
Yeah,
why
well, you
people
can
check
block them
out.
though.
Yeah, exactly. I like to mute them because then they think they're talking to me and it just doesn't even get anywhere near
Yeah,
me.
let them
So
scream into the abyss.
exactly. It's very fun actually. But but no, like that, yeah, that response is beyond. And now with TikTok, like the skits and like the sound memes and like it's just so
There's going
incredible.
to be cosplay if there hasn't been already.
Yes, there is gonna be cosplay, and that's wild to me. I'm just that's the best.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Daniel Jose Older, for chatting with me today. He's a writer, he's an editor, he's a composer, he's an activist, he's on social media. He's written 18 books, the most recent one being Ballad and Dagger, an Outlaw Saints novel. I recommend that you check it out and learn all about this world that you've never been to, that you're going to want to visit to multiple times. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.